So before we end this lecture on Dershowitz, there's one more wrinkle to our utility calculations that we're going to want to look at when we're thinking about trying to parlay that intuition about the ticking bomb case into a more general policy of more widespread use of torture. So far, our utility calculations have focused entirely upon the negative that results from the individual being tortured and the positive that results from any individuals that get saved as a result of the torture. However, if we're considering a policy of more widespread torture, then we need to take a more comprehensive approach to assessing the costs and the benefits, to calculating the net happiness. We want to consider things that aren't the direct outcomes of the events, but that are more collateral positives or negatives. And I'll focus pretty much on what I consider to be costs or negative outcomes that aren't normally taken into consideration when you frame the argument in terms of the ticking bomb case. So what I suggest is there's some plausible candidates out there when we ask whether or not torture generates negative outcomes that the ticking bomb torture advocates often just don't take into account, and that the scenario itself doesn't include at all. So to start with, if a country like the United States doesn't adhere to the treaties and international laws that it has entered into, doesn't honor its agreements, particularly with regard to things like torture, exchange of prisoners, and so on, then it's reasonable to expect that other countries won't adhere to those treaties either. The treaties become unenforceable if no one will adhere to them. And since the U.S. is involved in treaties with pretty much every country in the world about all sorts of things, including international treaties against torture and in favor of certain human rights, then violating those treaties would plausibly have a negative impact on everyone in the world, both in the U.S. and in the other countries. Another potential negative impact of a widespread torture policy is that torture is forbidden for reasons other than just moral condemnation. So if you were to take your training as a infantryman, one of the things they'll tell you is you should never, ever torture or mistreat other soldiers or civilians on the battlefield. One of the cardinal rules of engagement in modern armies. And if anyone ever asks you why, and oftentimes they'll just tell you, regardless of whether you ask, it's because torture or mistreatment breeds reciprocity. So when U.S. soldiers or agents of the U.S. government torture people, treat people badly, etc., then those people seek reciprocity. They want to treat the U.S. agents in a similar way. At the very least, they'll treat them in a distrusting and uncooperative fashion from then on. Another potential negative outcome of a widespread torture policy is that when people see U.S. agents torture people, then they come to hate the U.S. And this potentially increases the number of terrorists and even the number of governments in the world that are hostile to the U.S. or its interests. And that has a negative impact on everyone in the U.S. When the U.S. tortures people, we no longer have any moral high ground to confront violators of human rights like China or Russia. And in fact, China now releases a report documenting human rights abuses. And lastly, another potential negative collateral consequence of a widespread torture practice is that torturing people would create evil in the form of collateral unhappiness that's caused the friends and the family and the country persons are the individuals that get tortured. And so there's a wider net of net unhappiness that gets cast when you torture someone than just that individual themselves. So in this lecture, we've looked at Dershowitz's position that the United States and other countries, practically all other countries, should adopt a policy that creates an institutional mechanism of judicial review of warrants that would allow limited torture in some circumstances for the purpose of combating terrorism. We've looked at Dershowitz's argument for why he thinks that policy should be enacted moving forward. And we noticed that his argument for that policy is that there are three possible policies we could adopt about torture, and that two of them are not viable policies, and the third is his, and hence we should adopt his. And so we looked at the reasons why he thinks the other two policies aren't viable. We looked at his arguments against the current sort of ad hoc, off-the-books torture practices that have no oversight and so on, and why he thought those were bad practices and not good policies. And we didn't really contest that argument. But when we got to the argument that he offers up against a policy that simply has a universal ban on torture, we looked at the argument that he gave there. And his argument for why that's not a viable policy was that in the real world, universal bans on torture will inevitably fail, that there will always be backsliding into torture regimes, that there's widespread torture already in the world now, and hence a policy of universal prohibition against torture isn't an effective policy. And we looked at the arguments that he gave for why that was. And he talked a little bit about historically how countries have tortured. But primarily what he focused on was this argument that there is a case, the ticking bomb case, that generates a reasonably widespread and reasonably strong intuition on the part of people that torture is acceptable. And because people have that intuition, that there are cases where it's acceptable to torture people, then that will always work to undermine a universal exceptionalist ban on torture. And so we then turned our attention to that argument, that ticking bomb case. And we looked at the underlying structure of the argument, what its logic was, why we thought it generated the intuition that it did. We questioned whether or not that logic and that intuition were in fact really intuitions that we should accept and use as a basis for determining policy. And then we looked to see if, even if we accepted this intuition just as a brute fact about people's reactions, what were the implications that that intuition ought to have, or we could reasonably expect it to have as a justification for policies that allowed torture to some degree under some mechanism. And the sort of general tenor of this lecture has been primarily that there's not a lot of good reasons to suppose that that's an argument that can in any way be used to support even the sorts of positions that Dershowitz has. But the issues that we looked at, touched on, and talking about that are issues that everyone who's crafting policies about torture, who's crafting policies about terrorism, and people who are affected by those policies ought to consider in dealing with the real world situation that we find ourselves in.